So I have Behnam Ben Teleblue with me from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he is coming on to talk about everything Iran right now, particularly with and the Director of National Intelligence's warning yesterday that Iran has been interfering in the U.S. election just ahead of the November 2020 election, which will be taking place in about 2 weeks. So, Behnam, can you tell us what you've been hearing about this, what your concerns are?
Well, great to be with you. In short, Iran is stepping up its activities in the information warfare and cyber domain. I particularly believe these stories to be true. I've read everything that everyone else has in the open source press about them. Again, our authoritarian adversaries, be they Iran, Russia, China, and perhaps even North Korea, are looking to divide Americans against each other and are really looking to inject discord into our political system so close to our election. I've watched very slowly Iran evolve in the quality of its analysis about our domestic politics over the past decade, particularly as our domestic politics have become more divisive and more public. So in this sense, I echo the finding of William Evanina, the NCSC official, who earlier this August said that Iran doesn't want to see a continuation of the max pressure policy and is looking to turn Americans against their own democratic institutions and thwart the election chances of President Trump to that effect, which is what I believe he said back in August. Now, how does that square with this story today, which is Iran sending, I think, emails to allegedly registered Democratic voters trying to force them to vote for President Trump through the threat of violence? Again, this is another way to inject kind of hatred and discord into the U.S. political system, and again, divide Americans against each other. I think ultimately, from a policy perspective, Tehran can't handle 4 more years of maximum pressure. But in the immediate term, what they aim to do is exactly what you're seeing in the national media, which is people taking sides over an intelligence finding which should be nonpartisan.
Right, which is exactly what's come about, even with the revelation that these emails exist, and the division has already started. I mean, you see committees in Congress calling the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, a partisan hack. You have Senator Chris Murphy, who's questioning the intent. Was it to hurt Trump? Because it seems, these emails said you should switch to Republican, vote for Trump, or else. So a lot of people are questioning this. It's creating a lot of division between Republicans and Democrats. And they're also seizing, like you said, on the existing chaos, which is apparent in these emails as they appear to be Proud Boys. Is this the only set of emails that's come about? Are they using other means to take advantage of the civil unrest? Are they planning any kind of on the ground effort come election day?
Well, I'm quite unfamiliar if Iran is going to push for any on the ground effort. What we're seeing in cyberspace right now by Iran, and also in social media right now by Iran, is really in many ways an emulation of their highly successful proxy strategy that we've seen in the Middle East for so long. That strategy is to still strike, to still land blows, but do so from a distance, and to do so while masking or disguising its hand. So we know in Iraq, they have the Shia militias. In Lebanon, they have Lebanese Hezbollah. Here, right now, what Iran has done in the past 2 years is amplify false narratives, use bots, impersonate accounts, spoof accounts on social media platforms that are quite diverse, platforms like Twitter, for instance, to inject their kind of vitriol and sense and suss out our partisan cleavages, which could lead ultimately to a more accommodationist policy towards Iran. Now, again, sort of like Russia, they benefit from this immediate chaos. And, authoritarian adversaries have a long history of actually being able to point at U.S. domestic issues, whether real or perceived, and try to use them against America, which they actually see as a democracy being a tool in our national security arsenal to promote. Key point, important example, During our own civil rights movement here in the US in the 1960s, the Soviet Union often pointed to that as proof that America was an imperialist, racist power to thwart America's foreign policy goals abroad. Lest we forget, last month at the UNGA, Iran, fully cognizant of the eruption of social protest and unrest this summer over George Floyd and the BLM movement, likened Iran and other nations to George Floyd's suffering, something which is reprehensible because Iran habitually actually kills its own citizens, ethnic minorities, engages in sham trials and show trials, and as of last November, and we're coming up on the one-year anniversary of this, Iran violently suppressed protests that were touched off by a change in oil subsidies. So really, Iran should not be talking about this, but Iran definitely feels comfortable living in a glass house and throwing stones. And more importantly, as they see Americans more willing to put party or a particular ideology over country, they're going to suss out those themes, and so too will their partners, which are Russia and China, countries which the U.S. has great power competition with. So I would caution anyone, be they analysts, just lay voters, U.S. government officials, elected officials, tech company executives, tech company employees, to be very, very careful moving ahead, because the information domain is a domain for our adversaries to fight their wars against us.
So how is Iran using those platforms right now?
Well, you know, this evening, October 22nd, there's going to be another presidential debate. If you remember the last one just a few weeks ago, Twitter had to remove, I think the press had reported, up to 130 accounts tied to Iran that were aimed at inhibiting public discourse or hurting the public debate related to the presidential debate. I'm pretty sure they're going to be trying to do the same thing again this evening and throughout what's left of our election cycle. So in the current instance, when they're trying to engage in a mail intimidation campaign electronically, what the regime is trying to do is to try to touch on the fact that there are these partisan cleavages in our country, and actually use them to drive voters away from the polls, use them to have voters be suspicious of whatever the results are November 3rd or after November 3rd, use them to have suspicion of their neighbor. But ultimately, in the macro level, the goal for Tehran is to have America be weaker, more divided at home, and less cohesive abroad. There is a political and policy follow-on from that, which again we have to keep in mind, which is in August, that U.S. intelligence official did say that Iran doesn't want a continuation of max pressure, or feels that max pressure is going to be tied to regime change and wants to thwart the president's chances. I think that can't be absent from this conversation, but the priority needs to be Americans coming together to condemn all kinds of interference, Russian, Iranian, Chinese, or anything else.
Yeah, let's go into that a little bit. Just what the pressure is from the Trump administration, that's been throughout the Trump administration, that they have moved away from the JCPOA, but instead push for extreme sanctions unilaterally. How effective has that been? And is that driving any of this motion coming from Iran right now?
You know, that's an excellent question, because you can really chart Iran's behavior and approach towards America based on how the U.S. has been seeking to shake things up. Right now, it's 2020, and in fact, earlier today, there was a report coming out of an outlet, Middle East Eye, which had been talking about Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei actually being the one to call for, allegedly, a call for restraint in Iraq, and is allegedly behind this offer of getting those militias, which have been habitually firing rockets and mortars at the U.S. presence in that country, to back down, and allegedly could have been behind their ceasefire offer. Right now, you've seen Iran have a debate within itself that if it pushes Trump too far, will he escalate in a campaign year, or will he absorb this escalation because he doesn't want to get the U.S. into a war in the campaign year? Broadening this 2017, there was a bit of uncertainty by Iran over what Trump's Iran policy would be, and that uncertainty continued into what you mentioned, which is right before the U.S. left the nuclear deal on May 8th, 2018. That uncertainty led to a dampening of some of the more sensitive Iranian threat areas. Iran hadn't been overtly violating the JCPOA then, as it is now. Iranian missile tests, particularly of the medium range nuclear capable category, had fallen slightly. And as I believe the former DNI had said, the fast attack craft, meaning the little naval speedboats that Iran had been using to harass the U.S. in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz near the tail end of the Obama administration, the number of times they were doing that per year had decreased. With the U.S. restoring those tough sanctions that you said and consistently adding to them for the period of mid 2018 to mid 2019, that got Tehran to change course. Tehran realized that American unilateral sanctions have been actually tougher in record time than a decade of multilateral sanctions. So that has led Tehran to engage in the escalation that we saw last summer, which has led to the downing of an American drone, potential armed conflict in Iraq with escalation by Shia militias there, the mining in the Strait of Hormuz attacks, and everything else that we saw, including the cruise missile strikes against Saudi Arabia. So Iran is trying to get the U.S. to swerve, but it's trying to get the U.S. to swerve in a way that doesn't invite massive retaliation. And the kind of information warfare and cyber hacking and cyber espionage and cyber-enabled economic warfare that Tehran has been engaging in is totally consistent with that policy of striking blows, isolating yourself, and trying to get your adversary not to respond. So Iran wants America to absorb not only all this escalation, but to absorb these blows it's trying to land in our own social media platforms and against our election.
Right. And now, on the other hand, you did write a response to Vice President Joe Biden's op-ed in CNN recently, where he, blasted the Trump administration's. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I have some concerns about the potential direction of Iran policy if there's a change in 2020. And this is not coming from a partisan perspective. As someone who supports max pressure, I understand it's a highly risk-tolerant strategy, but I support the policy not for partisan reasons, but for historical reasons. The Islamic Republic of Iran is an ideological actor. It has a revisionist foreign policy in the Middle East. Because it believes that revisionism is integral to its identity and to its interests and to its strategy security, it is going to be very hard to disabuse that regime of not engaging in the kind of dangerous things that it engages in. The blueprint for me here is the Iran-Iraq War. That was a conflict that was fought for 8 years, from 1980 to 1988. For 7.5 years of the first of that conflict, the founding father of Iran's Islamic Revolution said war until victory. But in the end, he had to accept a mediocre UN ceasefire resolution that he likened to bargaining away his dignity before God and drinking from a poisoned chalice. So to me, that's proof that sustained pressure can actually get Iran to change course. And in fact, the Iran-Iraq War remains one of the few times Iran has abandoned a foreign policy goal. Lest we forget, the idea of toppling Saddam Hussein in Baghdad was not an American invention in 2003. The Iranians were trying to do that since 1980 with the Islamic Revolution. But nonetheless, because that conflict is so important, last year in 2019, 4 times Iranian officials compared the American sanctions policy under Trump to being more devastating than that bloody 8-year war. But if that bloody 8-year war got Iran to change course, then how come these sanctions, which don't require the U.S. to fire a single shot, aren't a good enough foreign policy tool to get Iran to change course? And with immense respect to the former vice president and the presidential contender Joe Biden, I think that it's a bit naive to say that if Iran comes back into compliance, then we'll come into compliance. Because the question is, what tool will Washington use if war is off the table, if sanctions relief that is premature, pallets of cash like your predecessor is a bad idea is off the table, and sanctions or coercive instruments are off the table? How are you going to get Iran to change course? And right now, Iran's domestic politics are hardening. There's been talk of a potential Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps general running for president next year. It's not confirmed that he'll actually run yet because he has to be confirmed by the Guardian Council. But this man is the ultimate security insider. If you thought dealing with Iran was tough now, wait till you see what happens mid next year. Even though Tehran cannot afford to live under 4 more years of max pressure, fully expect it to dig in its heels because there's a constellation of anti-diplomacy figures in Iran's most important political positions.
And going back to this max pressure campaign, do you expect that the Trump administration will push any further sanctions for this specific action?
I really hope that they do. I hope there's a lot that happens after this because, the U.S. Congress has shown how important the issue of election interference was for the past 3 years as related to Russia. We can't let our adversaries believe that they can divide us along partisan lines, that, Dems care about Russia, Republicans care about Iran. No, all Americans care about foreign election interference, full stop. And that is the best way to stop these kind of things in the long term. But in the short to medium term, public-private partnerships between the U.S. government and tech companies where these sort of activities are taking place to identify methodologies that state sponsors of terrorism or sowers of disinformation tied to a rogue regime engage in are going to be very key. You're going to have a method for disrupting, detecting, and deterring Iran, Russian, Chinese, or North Korean, or any other country, for instance, their state activities on social media, whether it's incitement or injecting vitriol or trying to divide us against each other. That is going to be a key methodology. The U.S. government needs to work out with some of these tech companies what is acceptable on these platforms. That's actually a very important point domestically moving forward as well. But there should be, I think, sanctions against the tech entities in Iran that may have spurred this is going to be key, but also more generally, an escalation and intensification of the maximum pressure policy. There are still many targets left for sanctioning. And that means that there is still room for this maximum pressure campaign to grow.